when I was invited to consider joining the Community of Practice for Childhood Dementia this year, I was the one invited to consider what theme or conversation point might be most relevant. And I guess I turned that around to consider, what's closest to my heart in this conversation around loss and grief and death and dying. And for me, this grief is certainly the thread that has woven its way through my professional life and through most of the work I do. But the concept of hope is one that very often can be misconstrued and often can be misconstrued as denial. And from my perspective and my experience, practice wisdom of working alongside so many families in the context of paediatric palliative care, I believe that denial is a bit of a dirty word, and that hope always overrides denial. And the more we can debunk these myths that hope can be dressed up as denial, then any opportunity I get to solidify our learning and exposure to these conversations, I do. So let's begin with a conversation around what we mean when we say, what is grief? And within the context of childhood dementia and the broader context of paediatric palliative care that I've worked in for so long, there are three concepts that continue to show up again and again. The first is that of ambiguous loss. So this differs from an ordinary loss, as with an ambiguous loss, there is no verification of death. So that may be a missing person, for example, or no certainty that that person will return to who they were. And we see this in the context of dementia across the lifespan. So in childhood dementia, the child is physically present, but cognitively and emotionally retreating. So the child is both here and in some ways not here as they were. Parents can be grieving who their child was or who they won't get to become while still caring for them every day. It's a tenuous, difficult experience and one that's extremely challenging to sit in for parents, but also professional caregivers as well. Then moving on to the concept of anticipatory grief. And this is the process of mourning, coping, and that planning and psychosocial reorganization that begins prior to the death of our person. So before an impending loss. Our bodies, our psyches, our minds and hearts and souls are all cleverly, gently preparing ourselves for this transition into the full experience of mourning and bereavement. And in childhood dementia, this can include mourning the past. So, for example, an earlier diagnosis or ability for a child, the present, so the loss is happening right within us in this moment, and the future, what's still to come. So again, a really complex experience in the context of childhood dementia. It's important to note that this experience of anticipatory grief, it can't be stopped. There's nothing we can do to fix or avert it. It's just a clever thing that happens within our psyche. And our role within the community that surrounds children and families is to recognize it, to name it, to contain it, and to support it. And finally, there is so much we could talk in terms of grief, but for the context for today, this concept of continuing bonds. And this was developed by Klaus Silverman and Nickman many years ago, inviting us to understand that when we lose our person or when our person dies, that we continue a bond with them forevermore. And that's a healthy adjustment in bereavement. However, in the context of childhood dementia, I would argue that we can align the concept of continuing bonds to a child who is losing their milestones. So it might be that parents and the extended family and the community around this child is finding new forms of the relationship, but also continuing a bond with the child that was. I'm speaking quite slowly because in the context of childhood dementia, language is so important. I never want to get it wrong. And if I do get it wrong sometimes, please accept my apologies. I'm doing my utmost to lead with deepest care and respect. So I'm now moving on to a conversation around what do we mean by hope? So hope is not a belief that things will be different. Hope is a new orientation toward what is presenting as the reality of life. So how do we define this concept of hope? Well, it can be this confident yet uncertain expectation of a future good that is realistically possible and personally meaningful. So hope is an enabler in grief. Hope is future orientated. However, future can be redefined. So we talk about this concept of refocused time, and it means hope can then be attached to either a moment, an hour, or a good day. So, in our normal and natural lives where life is faring well and we don't have the complexities of health issues within our lives, we may be anticipating in a hopeful way years ahead and planning months ahead. However, hope in this context can easily be refocused to a much shorter term or time frame. Hope often means that it links us to an anchor point in a situation or provides a sense of perspective that is an enabler in keeping us fully present at a time in our lives where we might otherwise be struggling to retain any sense of hope. And it's frequently described through this metaphor of light versus darkness. So where amongst this uncertainty of my life can there be some light? So I mentioned this concept of denial and the angst that I've often experienced when I hear folks saying, this isn't hope, this is denial, and it looks like denial to me. So the opposite of hope isn't grief, it's simply hopelessness. So hope and grief run alongside each other. They're woven throughout each other. And hopelessness simply means having no anchor point or perspective or feeling powerless in our experience. However, despair can arise from the same source as hope. So just experienced as hope that's more absent or declining. And it's important to note that hope and despair can be felt at the same time. So you can feel hopeless because you know there's nothing more that can be done. And in the context of childhood dementia, it may be that deep understanding that there will be no cure for my child. And yet you may remain hopeful that just maybe something will change. And that's sustenance for us. Hope is not denial. I'll just repeat that one more time. Hope and honest understanding are not opposites. There's a beautiful quote I have included from Chris Feudner. I'll read it slowly for those that are only on oral, can only hear today. Hope is like water existing in different states, exhibiting different properties. In between the solid and the gaseous, hope is liquid, it's flowing, assuming the shape of whatever it holds. So it's unique to everyone. Okay, so for those listening, the screen, I have proposed an integrated approach to hope in the context, of childhood dementia. I'll get my screen, go back. And so I'm looking at a slide that has 5 stages. However, I want to make it very clear, I'm not proposing that these stages are linear. It's just they're examples of experience within the childhood dementia experience where hope may show up and how it may show up and how we as professional caregivers can be enablers of hope. So the first is at new diagnosis, where naturally there might be a hope for a cure or for certainty. And the focus of hope in this context focuses on cure or treatment or fixing the condition. That families may be processing shock alongside this first wave of hope. And for us as professionals, our role is to be fully present and listen, to acknowledge that shock without rushing to reassure, to avoid correcting or labelling early hopes as unrealistic, but to stay curious around what they mean, knowing that it will be a natural flow for that person's psyche and experience to transition in different ways as they lean more fully into this new experience in their lives. The second stage for this context is early post-diagnosis, where it may be that the overarching experience is hope for stability and function, where the focus of hope shifts toward management and stability, and hope that progression may be slow, hope that therapies and equipment and supports preserve function and development for a child. And this is where parallel planning often begins in the context of paediatric palliative care, assuming there's been a referral, where we use this important phrase, holding hope for the best while preparing for the rest. How can we as professionals enable hope at this stage? Word I'm using loosely. We can support very practical hopes, like I suggested, with therapies, routines, equipment, ensuring this child can live to their full capacity by gently introducing this concept of parallel planning without it feeling like giving up. So, for example, a referral to paediatric palliative care is about bringing years to life. It's not about necessarily moving straight to conversations about death and dying. It's a time when we can ask open questions. What gives this family? What gives you as a family an anchor point or value right now? So we normalize that hope. We normalize that hope and worry can sit alongside each other. So moving to the next stage in this sort of integrated approach, where regression starts becoming apparent, where hope may shift more toward a hope for comfort and connection, where the focus of hope may be relocated toward comfort, symptom management, and preserving a connection with the child, hope for continuity of the child's identity, personality, and relationships, and hope found in moments rather than milestones. And as professionals, we can enable hope at this stage through acknowledging that both grief and hope can be present and at the same time, and neither need to be fixed, simply witnessed. That we can reframe hope toward refocused time today, right now, this visit, this moment, rather than looking too far ahead or acknowledging those things that aren't possible, but what is possible right now in this moment. To continue to see and refer to this child as a whole person and not just symptoms. And to attend to rehabilitation in the face of regression. And we know through the What Matters Most report, we heard loud and clear the importance of families being able to see that as healthcare providers, we are actively working with that family and that child to ensure their maximum quality of life. So the next stage, 4, is the advanced or late stage, where hope may be more aligned with moments and dignity and presence. And the focus here becomes increasingly present focused, right now, this moment, hope for dignity, comfort, and a child being free from pain, and hope for shared moments and memories. So a smile, a good day, time together right now. How, as professionals, can we enable hope at this stage? Well, we can prioritise physical comfort and symptom care, all hope related. Enable families to notice and hold on to small, present moment hopes, to communicate gently and honestly about what's ahead, following the family's lead, and ensuring we make space for siblings and the wider family's hope too. And finally, stage 5, end of life and beyond, where hope then may transition to hope for peace, for family, and for legacy. And the focus of hope here may be for peace and the absence of suffering, or hope for presence and togetherness, so no one being alone at this time. Hope that this child is seen and known to the very end and beyond. Hope for continuity and legacy, so this child's life matters, will always continue to matter, and to potentially helping other families in the future. And for some, there's certainly this existential notion around hope, or a spiritual hope, and continuing bonds beyond death. And for us as health and social care professionals, we can enable hope at this stage by being this calm, steady presence. So this concept of being together in despair and not being in isolation. To support family-led choices about place, about presence and rituals at end of life. To hold space for hope for a miracle without correcting it. That's just being human. And stay curious around what this hope represents. And acknowledge legacy and continuing bonds, and to explore ways to help support and honour these. Before I end, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a utopic vision of hope I've just presented. So as Claire mentioned, I was involved in the development of the What Matters Most report, and what we heard within that report was families' priorities for system change. And some of the key things we heard is that care coordination is lacking. Parents become operations managers. Navigating fragmented systems is onerous and lonely. That health professionals may lack specialised knowledge, and families then have to repeat their story again and again and become the educators in their child's life. That psychosocial support can be variable and may not be consistently available from diagnosis through to bereavement. That sometimes palliative approaches are introduced too late and not integrated from diagnosis. And I'm being very careful there, because there may be some families where that's not their chosen avenue of care, but it should necessarily be offered. Naomi may speak more to that. And of course, the other thing families told us with the NDIS funding, it just doesn't flex with regression, although I know there's been a lot of work done with NDIS and there are some improvements happening there. But what this means for hope is that this system navigation can drain the energy and that anchor point that hope depends on. It means repeatedly re-explaining the child and their condition and their experience and who they really are can leave families feeling unseen, and it can erode the concept of a relational hope. That variable support can mean facing the hardest moments without the connection that sustains hope. That late palliative involvement can mean comfort-focused hopes are addressed too late to matter and to make a difference. And finally, having to refight again and again for support undermines trust and a sense and a hope that any future can be planned for. So where these systems fall short, families then may be less able to hold on to hope, which then means their that capacity to have this enabler in their lives at such a difficult and complex time may be eroded.